and supporting the growing and gargantuan Russian war machine. And they are used in missiles, drones, munitions, and other weapons of war. The Russians are relying on American technology. Our sanctions system is a sieve. Our export control regime is lethally ineffective, and something has to be done. That's the reason we're here today. And we're here with 3 experts who can tell us about how these parts can be traced and tracked, how potentially their flow to Russia can be choked, stemmed, and stopped. The evidence points overwhelmingly to the fact that Russia relies on Western technology to power its military capabilities. And United States companies produce the majority of components found in Russian weapons. President Zelensky told me how cutting off Russia's supply of these components is crucial to Ukraine's defense. This stack of documents that he handed to me show that the technology used to fuel Russia's war machine flows through third-party intermediaries and bordering countries. The United States companies know, or should know, whether they violated the law. We are not concluding at this point, but we certainly have questions for them and questions for the United States Department of Commerce and the Department of the Treasury. Russia's success in its efforts to evade export controls can be seen in the very weapons recovered on the battlefield. And I am appalled that American technology breakthroughs are sustaining Russian belligerence. We opened this inquiry last year in order to understand this absolutely astonishing and appalling pattern. We focused on 4 American companies whose products have been repeatedly identified in greater number and frequency as continually and disproportionately showing up in Russian weapon systems. We need to understand how these American products are getting to Russia despite export controls and what more can be done to stop them. Although our inquiry is ongoing, our initial findings show irrefutably that those third-party intermediaries located in countries bordering Russia are used to evade U.S. export controls. This fact is a secret hidden in plain sight. I'd like to enter into the record the subcommittee memorandum that we prepared providing evidence of this fact, and I see no objection. The astronomical increases in exports to Kazakhstan from these 4 companies, going up 1,000 times from 2021 to 2022, are matched in the same period by exports going to Georgia, 34 times greater exports to Armenia, 28 times export to Turkey, more than doubled, and exports to Finland were roughly 1.5 times higher. These stark increases are part of a larger trend. We know that other bordering countries outside of these 5, notably China, are home to entities being used by Russia to evade our export controls. And I hope this hearing will enable us to understand what more can be used to prevent technology from going to Russia. Russia has been so successful in evading U.S. export controls that its ability to import critical battlefield goods has nearly recovered to levels seen before the invasion of Ukraine. That status quo is unacceptable. This issue is critical not only to defeating Russia, But also, beyond that conflict, it has implications for our national security across the globe. Semiconductor export controls are an increasingly important part of our national security. Export controls are one of the ways we hope to maintain our dominant position in artificial intelligence and constrain countries like China from surpassing our capabilities in AI. They're also crucial to our security in other parts of the world, including defending ourselves from overtly hostile regimes like Iran and North Korea. So we need effective semiconductor export controls. Our technology cannot simply be available for whoever wants to access it. The evidence collected from the battlefield in Ukraine can provide guidance to us in defending our national security on technology in many other areas. I hope our work will uncover not just what has gone wrong, but recommendations and solutions to stop future exports of United States technology and from keeping it out of the hands of the Russian war machine. Again, whether there have been violations of law, we are not concluding at this point, but we have strong questions for these companies, and we know that enforcement has been lacking. I commend the Biden administration for imposing additional sanctions, which they announced just days ago. But sanctions are dead letter unless they are enforced. And we are writing to the Commerce Department in a letter that I am also making part of the record today without objection to ask many of these same questions. I turn to the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a written opening statement that I'll just ask that it be entered in the record, and I'll just make a couple comments here. In your opening statement, you talked about the growing Russian war machine. I think that's one of the realities that we have to face that we're not really acknowledging. I've been as supportive as I am of the Ukrainian people, as much as I think Vladimir Putin is an evil war criminal. The reality we have to face is that Vladimir Putin will not lose this war. The Chairman talked about defeating Russia. Russia has 4 times the population of Ukraine. They are producing about 4.5 million 155 millimeter shells at a cost of $600 a shell. The West is somewhere around 1 million shells a year at the cost of $5,000 to $6,000. We ought to be doing oversight on that as well, but that's a separate issue. The average age of a Ukrainian soldier right now is 43 years. There are reports, quotes by some of Zelensky's inner circle saying, send us all the weapons you have, we just don't have the men to fire them. Now again, I hate that reality. It's an awful reality. But if we're really concerned about the people of Ukraine, and I don't doubt they want to fight, but if we're concerned about the people of Ukraine, we have to understand what is happening to their country. Somewhere around 100,000 dead, killed in action, civilians, probably more on the Russian side, 500,000 total casualties on both sides. Nobody knows the exact figures. $400 billion to $1 trillion worth of economic devastation of Ukraine. Every day that this war goes on, more Ukrainians die, more Russian conscripts die, and I take no joy in that. There's people yanked out of their villages to be sent as cannon fodder into the front line of a bloody stalemate. More of Ukraine gets destroyed. So I think it's an interesting hearing. I was criticized many years ago when I questioned the ability of sanctions to do what they were really designed to do. That they maybe do more harm, for example, to our allies than they're actually doing. I think that's kind of the record of the sanctions against Russia. They just haven't worked because their war machine is growing. You know, some of the justification for spending $60 billion on funding Ukraine is, oh, it's really not going to Ukraine. It's going to build up our military-industrial complex like it needs more building up. It's going to create jobs in our state. I think that's a pretty depraved justification for supporting Ukraine. So again, we need to look at the reality situation. I know our witnesses here will say that there's all kinds of things we can do to, plug the holes. I doubt it. I saw the chart there. It'll just be Huawei. It'll be other people supplying these things. You have to recognize that reality. I don't like it. But if we're going to drive policy, we need to recognize the reality of things. We keep pushing Russia. They have nuclear weapons. I think our policy ought to be, how do we start reducing tensions in the world? And I would argue that the best way to do that is for America to be strong. And it starts with addressing our debt and deficit. It's out of control. It starts with securing our borders, not letting military-age men from China, from 150 different countries all over the world, into our country unopposed. It's about using our fossil fuel resources rather than artificially drive up our energy costs. It's about stopping deficit spending so we don't continue to drive inflation. That's how you strengthen this country. That's how you make the world a more secure place. So we need to start facing those realities, and as interesting as this hearing may be in terms of, sanctions being evaded, they're always going to be evaded. You plug one hole, another hole is going to be opening up. It's going to be whack-a-mole. So it's a reality we have to face. But we better start facing reality if we're going to start producing public policy that makes any sense in this country whatsoever. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Johnson. I'm going to introduce the witnesses, then swear them in and ask you for your opening statements. James Byrne is the founder and director of the Open Source Intelligence and Analysis Group at the Royal United Services Institute, the world's oldest defense think tank. His team has generated reports based on open source actionable intelligence on Russia's military, supply chains, and work with government organizations, including the United States Department of State, to help trace and shut down these pathways. Elena Rybakova is the Director of International Affairs, the International Affairs Program, and Vice President for Foreign Policy at the Kyiv School of Economics. She is also a non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics and Bruegel. Ms. Rybakova has been a co-author on numerous reports out of the KSC Institute examining the continuing ability of Russia to acquire United States technology despite export controls. Damian Spleeters is the Deputy Director of Operations at Conflict Armament Research, an independent research organization that sends investigators to private conflicts to access weapons and other commodities recovered from the battlefield. Mr. Spleeters has deployed to conflict zones around the world, including Iraq, Syria, and Ukraine, to trace the diversion of weapons and commercial commodities. We look forward to all of your testimony. I'm going to ask you to rise and take the oath, as is our custom on this committee. Do you swear that the testimony that you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you. Mr. Byrne, if you would begin.
Chairman Blumenthal, Ranking Member Johnson, it is really a great honor to be here today. Thank you very much for having me and us. My name is James Byrne. I'm the Director of Open Source Intelligence and Analysis at the Royal United Services Institute. RUSI is, as you kindly introduced us, a very old institution. We were established in 1831 by the Duke of Wellington after the Napoleonic Wars. Today we're independent, but for almost 200 years we've worked on questions of military sciences, questions on how to fight and win wars. And today we do many other things than direct military sciences. We do intelligence work, open source intelligence work, financial crime, and a range of other portfolios. Since the war started in Ukraine, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, We have been engaged in work in country. Several members of the Royal United Services Institute have been there many times doing a range of different pieces of work. But one of those pieces of work has been to look very closely at Russian weapon systems, how they're built, and to look at the components within them. When we were first in country, and this was very early on in the nature of the war, the invasion went very badly for the Russians. They expected an easy victory, and they were met with indomitable resistance. They lost huge volumes of platforms, electronic warfare complexes, signals intelligence complexes, tactical radios, missiles were shot down, UAVs were captured. Across this huge range of platforms, we got to look inside of them, and so did a number of other people. What was shocking was that all of these systems that we saw were built with our technology. It is not just US technology, it's technology from the United Kingdom, from the Netherlands, from Germany, from a range of Western countries and our partners and our allies. Nobody had ever seen inside Russian weapon systems before, at this scale, across this breadth. It was something that we hadn't even an inkling of, even during the Cold War. And I think that reality is really quite shocking, that despite all of the rhetoric of the Russian government about import substitution and independence, they rely on our technology to build systems that are designed to threaten us and our allies. Now, irrespective of the progress of the war in Ukraine or, the particularities of the situation on the ground, my belief, and I know many of my colleagues, is that we should do our utmost best to prevent our technology being used in weapons that are designed to kill us and our friends. And this is not simply just a question about Russia. You will hear testimony, I think, later today, but it is not just Russian weapon systems, it's Iranian platforms. It's very recently North Korean platforms. It is technology that fits into those systems that the Russians cannot simply replace. They cannot easily go to other manufacturers of these components because our countries are the most sophisticated manufacturer of these things, and companies themselves create specialized things that are designed to have these roles. Modern weapons platforms cannot work without these things. They are the brains of almost all modern weapons platforms, from precision munitions to missiles to radios to electronic warfare complexes. And so, in that sense, we have great leverage over our adversaries. Now, sanctions are difficult to enforce. Export controls are difficult to enforce, and that is true. We see those components in those weapons platforms. But because it's difficult, it doesn't mean that we should not do it. In fact, we should try our best to make it happen. And of course, there is a selection bias here in that we do not see the shipments of components that we stopped, the vessels that we interdicted, the people that we arrested, because those components never made it, and they never got into those platforms, and they never killed Ukrainians, and they were never used. I know from my experience that that has happened many times. And I think we can do more, and we should do more. And it is not just the role of the United States, it is the role of the United Kingdom. We've been close allies and partners on this for a long time. It is the role of the European Union. It is the role of our friends in Japan and South Korea and Taiwan to assist with this. And we should have as active in a program as possible to prevent this happening. And one last thing before I finish is it's not just a question about microelectronics, it's a question about all sorts of technology that our adversaries need. It's carbon fiber, it's polymers, it's lenses, it's cameras. It's a huge range of different aspects of this story. And if we can prevent them, if we can stop them, as best we can, we help the Ukrainians and we help ourselves from fighting an adversary with our technology down the line. Thank you very much. It's been an incredible honor to be invited here today, and I look forward to hearing my colleagues and answering questions from you.
Chair Chair Blumenthal, Ranking Member Johnson, members of the committee, thank you so much for the opportunity to testify before you today. I'm from Kyiv School of Economics. It's a university that has been a long-standing university with more than 700 students now and more than 70 staff doing research and teaching despite the bombing, sometimes in the shelter, and contributing to our research. I'm also a non-resident fellow at the think tank here in Washington, D.C. and in Brussels, which gives me an opportunity to focus my policy work not just from data analysis, but all the way through the chain to the policy work. So my testimony today is not on behalf of any organization, it's just from me. There are several key messages that I would like to emphasize in my testimony. One, that despite Russia's effort to diversify its military production, it still overwhelmingly relies on foreign components. So national authorities in Ukraine have disassembled a lot of weapons. It's more than 2,800 components at this stage from the whole range of military production. And it's available online. You can look at the photos. You can trace some of them there. So I strongly recommend you look at that website. And it shows that 95% of components comes from the coalition countries. More than 70% from the US alone. And that is because US has a significant advantage in production of some of these innovative technologies, which is fantastic. And it also tells that we have leverage via export controls to put pressure on Russia. The second message is that Russia continues to import significant amounts of these components. In the first months after the beginning of the full-scale invasion in 2022, these imports have halved, so there was an impact. But by 23, we have only 10% reduction in imports of these battlefield goods. The third message is that more effective export controls will require buy-in from our corporates. The success of government policy always hinges greatly on private sector involvement. Decades ago, when we started with the anti-terrorist financing, anti-money laundering measures and financial sector sanctions, US government required buy-in and cooperation of the financial industry. And we saw great success there. The transparency and the ability of the financial industry to block malign actors from accessing our systems has changed dramatically. So we can use the lessons and also use the information from the financial sector industry to be able to help us enforce these export controls. And four, assessing export controls circumvention is not just about helping Ukraine. It's not just about preventing Russia from further aggression in Ukraine. It is also about credibility of our whole system of economic statecraft. Malign actors worldwide are watching whether they will be credible or it's just words that we put on paper. It is time to assess what works and what doesn't. We have the opportunity to do sort of homework and see how we can use export controls to effectively address challenges posed by China in strategic technologies. So export controls must be enforced. And my key recommendations for congressional consideration on how to do so are as follows. First, it is critical to strengthen our institutions. They've gotten much expanded responsibilities, but their funding has not been increased to match those responsibilities. Second, we do need to bolster corporate responsibility. Effective control of supply chains must start at the point of production and the initial sale of the item. To incentivize corporations to do so, we need to show that we are capable of enforcing export controls and investigate and impose meaningful fines when necessary. Third, we should leverage the role of the financial industry in global trade. Corporate compliance departments can learn from the banking system compliance department. We have experience of more than 20 years of doing so. And we also can match the information between the two. Four, remaining loopholes in the export controls regime must be closed. We still have work to be done on harmonization of the systems. When the systems are harmonized and the rules are harmonized among us and our partners, it is much easier and more effective for the corporate sector to implement those controls without onerous reporting. Finally, we must improve multilateral cooperation. We should consider a new multilateral export treaty similar to the Cold War COCOM, replacing the existing Wassenaar Agreement, of which Russia is a member and can block any of the control measures. Moreover, the US is a leading actor in export controls. We are the thought leader on export controls, where our institutions are much stronger than those of our allies. So we should encourage our allies to enact legal and institutional changes, facilitating an effective multilateral strategy to undermine the military capacities of Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. Let me conclude by stressing that while export controls have had some effect on limiting Russia's military capacity and production, we must intensify our efforts. Preserving the credibility of our economic statecraft is crucial to send a clear message to malign actors worldwide that their actions will result in severe consequences. I'm deeply grateful for the opportunity to testify in front of you today, and I look forward to questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Spleeter.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Blumenthal, Ranking Member Johnson, and distinguished members of this subcommittee. My name is Damien Spleeters, and I am the Deputy Director of Operations at Conflict Armament Research, CAR. CAR is an independent research organization that investigates the diversion of weapons and related commodities in conflicts around the world. What distinguishes us from other organizations is our boots-on-the-ground approach, coupled with a robust tracing process resulting in evidence-based first-hand findings. What that means, essentially, as you noted in your introduction, is that we send investigators to active conflicts to access weapons and other commodities recovered from the battlefield. Such items usually bear lot, batch, or serial numbers, which our investigators document in detail. We then work with industry to understand how the documented items were diverted and identify the entities responsible for the diversion. What is commonly known now could not have been imagined 2 years ago. Russian, Iranian, and North Korean weapons are full of semiconductors bearing the marks of American and European companies. These semiconductors vary in sophistication and importance, but it is fair to say that without them, Russia, Iran, or North Korea would not be able to sustain their war effort. This is both a curse and a blessing. A curse because US-led technological advancement is being diverted by US adversaries for use against US interests. A blessing because it means the US and its allies can critically impact the ability by Russia, Iran, and North Korea to produce weapons. Western companies design chips made by specialized plants in other countries, and they sell them by the millions with little visibility over the supply chain of their products beyond 1 or 2 layers of distribution. This creates and sustains narratives that are at odds with facts. That Russia rips off chips from household appliances like washing machines, that Russia buys them on major online retailer websites, that these chips are so common and the visibility over supply chains so limited that it's impossible to trace them and identify their points of diversion. These narratives could not be further from the truth. Russia acquires chips using third-country distributors which can be identified. CAR does it by utilizing a method we've developed over the past decade, the 4 T's. Tracking and documenting commodities, tracing them with industry, triangulating responses, and trade mapping. CAR has already taken apart more than 220 Iranian, North Korean, and Russian weapon systems in Ukraine in the past 2 years, documenting more than 10,000 semiconductors and identifying more than 250 companies linked to their production. We've issued more than 1,000 trace requests, yielding more than 350 responses. Compiling responses has allowed us to triangulate entities of interest for further investigation. Pooling information in collaboration with industry enables CAR to generate data that would otherwise be inaccessible to isolated manufacturers. CAR then looks at the trade profiles of the identified historical customers and discerns whether they continue to acquire semiconductors through third country entities. We have so far confidentially identified more than 200 non-sanctioned companies of interest, half of which are not in Russia, linked to the acquisition of transfer of semiconductors. Based on this work, we have identified the following opportunities. Field monitoring and documentation is important to generate primary information on diversion patterns and should therefore be prioritized. Coordination between government, industry, and civil society leads to the identification of diversion by specific entities. Such identification could not have happened without the collaborative and holistic approach that we have elected to undertake. Such coordination should thus be supported and increased. If manufacturers required point-of-sale data from their distributors, this would greatly improve their ability to trace recovered semiconductors and identify problematic supply networks. In cases where strict confidentiality clauses prohibit information sharing, companies should consider whether the evidence diversion of their goods is sufficient reason to waive confidentiality for the purpose of cooperating with international tracing efforts. A lack of sales record has made the tracing of semiconductors more difficult. Industry should consider improving record keeping. And finally, although control lists and end-user certificates are important methods to counter the diversion of goods to unauthorized users, they cannot solely be relied on to stop unauthorized acquisition. I thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today, and I look forward to answering your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you to all of you, and I accept the contention that enforcement is difficult. I have spent most of my career as a prosecutor and law enforcer, and I hear constantly, as I did continuously when I was a prosecutor, that enforcement may be futile, but that is no excuse for failing to do better, particularly in this instance when Russian weapons using American technology are killing and maiming Ukrainians on the battlefield and in their cities, their schools, their hospitals, and their apartment houses. And that is the reason that President Zelensky feels so passionately about this cause and why he encouraged me personally to pursue it. So I begin with a working theory of the case, that these companies know or should know where their components are going, and that they have the capacity to trace and track those components well enough to do something more. Obviously, the government has a responsibility to enforce export controls. But Mr. Spleeter, you have talked just now about tracing, and I'd like to ask you about these four companies, Intel, Texas Instruments, AMD, and Analog Devices, and about the pattern that we've shown of the increase in these products going to just a few countries through third-party intermediaries. What can you tell us about what these companies know or should know?
Thank you very much for your question. I'm going to disappoint you, I feel, because our methodology precludes us from pointing fingers at industry. We want to approach this issue with a collaborative approach. So we are sending trace requests to all the companies that we have identified for two reasons. The first one is to identify whether the components are genuine or not. That's very important. We know that there is counterfeit going around in weapons, and we certainly wouldn't want to point fingers at companies that are...
Well, let me interrupt you just because my time is limited, and I apologize. But I'm not asking you to point fingers. You have asked these companies for whatever they know about tracing, correct?
Correct.
Ms. Rybakova, let me ask you the same question. What should these companies know about where their products are going?
It is hard for me to say exactly what they known or should have known. What I can say is that a team of a couple of programmers at the Kyiv School of Economics has processed a lot of the data, and the reports that you have seen is a work of just a few people. So shortly after we published our report, it was featured in a number of the press reports, and also a number of the financial institutions have confidentially reached out to us to cooperate with their compliance departments. We haven't heard that from the corporates yet.
Mr. Byrne?
My personal position on this is, I take Damien's point, and I think the companies now know that many of their components, some may well be counterfeit, but likely tens of thousands of their components have ended up in Russian weapons platforms and in Iranian ones, and potentially, obviously, in North Korean ones. So they know that it's happening. They know that it's a significant issue. And if I were them, obviously I would be looking at my internal compliance departments, and I would be thinking, how far can I trace them? What can we do to improve our visibility in our supply chain? There are institutes like our colleagues, there is mine. We've done a huge amount on this. We've generated ourselves dozens and dozens of private intelligence reports on these supply chains. We're a small think tank in the United Kingdom. So if I were them, that's how I'm thinking, how do they do it? What can we do to copy that? And can we improve our ability to trace these components through the supply chains and identify bad actors? That's my position on it.
I want to hold up a photo of a particular missile that was recovered on the battlefield. I understand that this photo features a type of missile that flies at very low altitudes, making it hard to detect. Low altitude, slow-flying drones or missiles are the next one of the ongoing present threats to both United States forces and Ukrainian forces, very difficult to intercept and counter. Mr. Spleeters, can you tell us about this weapon and the attack that it was used in?
This is an Iskander cruise missile that one of my Ukrainian colleagues took a photo of. And it was recovered mostly intact, in this case, from the battlefield in Ukraine. And then we were able to open those systems and document all the components that were found inside. For a cruise missile, about 50% is non-Russian components. And when you look at drones, you go to almost 100% non-Russian components.
And can you tell us whether this weapon was one that was stockpiled before the beginning of the war, or has it been manufactured since the beginning?
So that's difficult for us to say, but we can make that determination by looking at the date of production of components. We found a lot of components that were produced before 2022, which seems to show that Russia has the intention to stockpile on components before their invasion, knowing that export control and sanctions would be hitting, and in a way to mitigate that effect. But more and more now, we are seeing components that are produced after February 2022, and that should be a concern for manufacturers.
So we're seeing these components in weapons manufactured after the beginning of the war and after the sanctions were imposed?
Correct.
Thank you. Let me ask you, Ms. Rybakova, your organization's recent reports show that these 4 companies under investigation by the subcommittee were among the top producers of microchips used in battlefield goods. Given the pattern of the flow of these components to specific countries, do you think that the chip manufacturers should have been aware of these trends?
We see 2 critical changes in the patterns. One is production outside the United States. So the production, which is not atypical, but it's taking place now more outside the components that are going to Russia tend to be produced outside the United States. So it's maybe China, Malaysia, Philippines, and other countries. And also we're seeing a pattern of on-shipment, where maybe a distributor based in Turkey or UAE or one of the countries that you have shown on the graph bordering Russia, and then the shipment takes place. So there is an adjustment in the patterns. We also see companies from Russia, maybe sometimes the same, sanctioned by United States, buying a bulk of those components. So at least we see the evidence that the change of the pattern has happened in response to the export controls, including by these leading US-based companies.
Thank you. I'm going to turn to the ranking member for his questions. I should have said we're doing 7-minute rounds. I'll have more questions, I hope, in a second round. Thank you.
Hey, Mr. Chairman, you used the word feudal. And again, I think that's my concern. I think so much of this is feudal. I regret that, but I think it's true. Mr. Spleeters, you had an interesting comment in your testimony. You said you could not have imagined, this could not have been imagined 2 years ago. Can you explain what you mean by that?
I think it's difficult to imagine that weapons used by U.S. adversaries actually require and rely so much on U.S.-led technology. I think people might have been a bit naive in thinking that these countries might rely just on their domestic production, but this is not the case. That's what I meant.
So we do have in place export controls over certainly specialized military components, correct, Mr. Burns? Yes. To what extent is what you're finding in these weapons specialized components versus commodity microchips that these countries probably can't produce on their own, but are dual use? I mean, that's always a problem, right? I mean, how many of these are specialized versus basically dual use microprocessors?
So there's a mixture. There's certainly a significant amount of export control components, and there's a significant amount of non-export control components if we go back to the start of the war. But if we look at things which are recovered from the battlefield now, we can find, and we've seen, very specialized pieces of equipment, particularly focused on the facilitation of artificial intelligence computations as a counter to prevalent electronic warfare, for example.
Specialized to the extent they would have already been subject to export controls?
So
they were already evading those, or?
Yes. The Russians have always, it's been going for over 100 years. Of course, they have built a huge architecture, and they did during the Cold War, to try and attempt to acquire our technology.
So a comment was made that so much of this is already being manufactured in other countries like China, not exactly a friendly nation just right now. To what extent are the components that are being analyzed come from, for example, Chinese factories or overseas factories? I mean, I think part of the problem is so much sophisticated microprocessors are not produced in America anymore. Are most of them from overseas?
This is a question for me. Yeah, that's the nature of the semiconductor industry. So a lot of these manufacturers, so-called manufacturers, are not exactly manufacturers. Their brands is on the chip, but the chip is made by another company, another plant, usually outside the United States. That doesn't mean that they do not have a certain responsibility over the production of those chips.
They could exercise control, but far more difficult when those things are being made, for example, in China.
They are made with U.S. technology, using U.S.
I understand, but again,
machineries.
they're being made overseas, so that's an issue. I mean, I just did a quick calculation for Intel. According to the chairman's figures, about $351 million worth of components, which sounds like a lot, but Intel sells $54,000 million worth of sales every year. So it's about 0.6% of their sales. It was about 0.8% of AMD sales, more so of analog devices. Again, I'm not defending the companies. I'm just saying how difficult this is and what you're asking to be done. I go back to that word futile is part of my concern. To switch off electronic components, one of the things that was going to supposedly bring Russia to the knees is we were going to clamp down and we weren't going to buy any Russian oil. But again, oil, like money, is fungible. I think it's interesting if you take a look at the oil prices leading up to the 2022 time period, 42, then $72 a barrel, then it hopped up to 101 when the war started. So, and by the way, Russian exports never dropped. They just found other markets. Now it's settled down in the $80 a barrel range, according to one measurement of oil. So sanctions on oils didn't work. It's made it more difficult for Europe to obtain gas and probably increase the price to their consumers. So again, that's, I think, one of those sanctions I'd be concerned about, is it doing more harm to us than harm to Russia. I thought it was interesting in the Tucker Carlson interview with Vladimir Putin. He was taunting us, basically, saying that, you guys, one of your greatest assets is the fact that you are the world's reserve currency. And by blocking our access to utilizing financial systems and selling our oil in dollars, we've just been forced to sell them in rubles and Chinese yuan, weakening your position as the world's reserve currency. I mean, there's my concern. I mean, I don't like that reality. I mean, I wish we could just turn up the dial and say, okay, you're evil, you're a war criminal, we're going to cramp down on sanctions, and we're going to bring you to your knees. It just didn't happen. And again, the fact that this bloody stalemate is continuing, as the chairman said, it's the Russian war machine is growing. It's getting stronger. They're spending more on defense. And by the way, my guess is they're just going to get to be more and more sophisticated, evading the sanctions and finding components, or potentially finding other suppliers and ramping up their, like Huawei. You'd probably create some greater opportunity for Huawei. So I mean, there's the very sad, harsh reality of what we're trying to accomplish and our inability to accomplish it. I mean, what am I seeing that's incorrect there? Mr. Byrne.
Respectfully, I disagree. So, for example, I have a contract between the Russians and the Iranians for munitions. It's not an open source contract, but it's a contract for the delivery of munitions. That's priced in dollars. It's a contract between Russia and Iran priced in dollars. I've seen contracts for and prices for Russian oil is priced in dollars. So whilst Putin can say those things in the interview, it's not always the case that it's true.
That's what I'm trying to find out, what's true, what's not. It's
Yeah.
awful hard to discern.
The second thing I would say, imagine if tomorrow we just dropped export controls and sanctions on North Korea. Imagine if we just made a decision. We said, okay, we're just going to abandon these. North Korea would arm and build more weapons. It would build more sophisticated weapons. It would integrate AI into those weapons platforms. It would be able to field munitions that reach more US cities. So whilst the sanctions and the export controls don't stop everything in one go, it's not a silver bullet. They do stop a huge amount of things that you don't see as a result of the fact that they're in force. And I think we would all be mad if we were to immediately stop export controls and sanctions against, for example, the North Koreans or the Iranians of this world.
So I think the question is, how can we be more effective?
Yeah.
Again, I'm not opposed to it. It's just, I'm just trying to, what is the reality situation and what do we need to do to become more effective? Again, I come from a manufacturing background in medical device packaging. You had traceability throughout the process. I mean, almost to the little plastic pellet. There's probably no reason we can do this, but again, it gets far more complex when we're manufacturing overseas, which is one of the reasons trying to attract more of that manufacturing back here, we'd have greater control. So I'm past my time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Johnson. Senator Hassan.
Well, thank you, Chairman Blumenthal and Ranking Member Johnson. Thank you to our witnesses as well for being here today and for your efforts to document Putin's invasion of Ukraine and help the United States and our allies hold Russia accountable for a brutal, unjustified, unprovoked invasion. As the chair just mentioned, I was on the delegation trip to Ukraine just at the end of last week. We met with President Zelensky, we met with his top military leaders, we met with American experts on the ground in Ukraine, and through all of that, we discussed the critical importance of continued U.S. military and financial support. It is clear that with our help, Ukraine will win this war, and I want to be very clear about that. Without it, they will lose. The Ukrainian people are extraordinarily innovative, they are strong, and they are determined. They have fought off the Russian behemoth for 2 years. Remember when Putin first invaded? Everybody said they have 2 weeks. They've been not only on the ground holding them off, they have retaken some of the territory that he initially took. And no amount of Russian misinformation can change that. The Ukrainian people are clear-eyed about the challenges that they face, but they remain determined because they know that freedom is worth fighting for. And they are sacrificing their lives to fight for what we have and for what democracies around the world have. Authoritarians around the world are watching what we do. China, Iran, North Korea. And they are questioning whether democracies will support the Ukrainian people in this fight. And the Ukrainian people, let's be clear, are not asking us to send our sons and daughters to this fight, to this front. They are asking the United States to do what the United States can do, which is manufacture the level of munitions and weapons and get it to the front as they sacrifice their lives in this fight. The Senate recently passed a national security supplemental funding bill with vital aid for Ukraine. Our colleagues in the House must now act to get aid to Ukraine across the finish line. It's the most important thing that we can do to stand up to Putin and help Ukraine win. At the same time, we have to take action to further degrade Russia's military capabilities by improving the effectiveness of our sanctions and our export controls. And there's plenty of room for improvement, which I think is what the point of this hearing is. So I look forward to this discussion. I urge my colleagues to remain focused on getting aid to Ukraine and ensuring the defeat of Putin's invasion. So my first question to Ms. Repakova. Congress clearly needs to do more to ensure that American-made semiconductors and advanced technologies are not being used against Ukraine. I'm really concerned that Russia is circumventing our export controls through partnerships with other adversaries. For example, under current export control laws, adversaries like China can legally purchase component parts of advanced semiconductor manufacturing equipment. Using this equipment, China can then manufacture and sell advanced semiconductors to Russia. Would imposing explicit multilateral export controls on the component parts of advanced manufacturing machinery, such as semiconductor manufacturing equipment, help stop Russia from avoiding U.S. export controls through partnerships with China?
Thank you so much for your question. We have indeed seen a pickup in machinery imports by Russia because they are preparing for possible measure like that, because that allows them to insulate, isolate themselves for somewhat longer. We have traditionally seen imports of components, but not, and maybe some repair parts, but not of the machinery outside the normal business cycle. We have seen a significant pickup. So yes, working multilaterally with our partners to block that, it is critical. It is sort of staying ahead of the game. It's staying ahead of Russia's circumvention techniques.
Thank you. Mr. Byrne, as you mentioned in your testimony, in order to sustain his war against Ukraine, Putin has found ways to evade Western sanctions and export controls. Recent reporting from the New York Times has highlighted the methods that Russia uses to avoid oil sanctions by hiding and spoofing the locations of vessels carrying its oil. While this reporting was focused on Russian oil, these deceptive practices can help adversaries evade various kinds of sanctions and export controls, including acquiring technology that supports Russia's military efforts. How would American enforcement efforts benefit from a dedicated system to track, identify, and interdict suspect vessels that disable or spoof their location?
Thank you for the question. We, for several years, have worked very closely on illicit shipping, North Korea's illicit shipping, currently Russia's illicit shipping. There is a huge amount to do on this portfolio, but it's a critical avenue to be able to harm our adversaries and disrupt their activities, is to focus on the vessels that are moving weapons, that are moving equipment, that are moving oil, that are evading sanctions. To do that, we need to have visibility on what they're doing. We need to be able to defeat the deceptive practices that they engage, and we need to do it ultimately with commercial and open source data. We need to generate those intelligence products so that they can be shared with our partners across the world, so that they can be shared with countries that can take action. So I think very much so. And as we've seen recently, how did the munitions move between North Korea and Russia? Very like thousands of containers of North Korean munitions. They moved on Russian vessels that were not transmitting on AIS, that were engaged in deceptive practices that had built front company structures to hide the real owners. So I think very much so, and I think it would be welcome.
Well, thank you. We have a bill, and I hope the Senate will take it up and pass it. It's called the Vessel Tracking for Sanctions Evasion Act. It's a bipartisan bill that I introduced with Senator Langford, and it would create a dedicated pilot program within the Department of Homeland Security to achieve these goals. So I urge my colleagues to look at it. Mr. Chair, if I could ask one more question, sure, and I will conclude. To Mr. Spleeters, as we just heard from Mr. Byrne, and as you discussed in your testimony, the Russian government increasingly obtains restricted goods through third countries referred to as transshipment, including many of its computer chips. I agree with you that private companies need to improve their due diligence processes to better control the final destination of their products. At the same time, I understand that companies may struggle to see through potentially sophisticated deception efforts. What are organizations such as yours doing to share information with technology makers so that they can take appropriate steps to secure supply chains and ensure that critical technology doesn't end up in the hands of adversarial nations?
Thank you very much for the question. I'll try to be brief. The first thing that needs to be done is to know what components are being used. If you don't open the weapon system, you cannot do anything. So you need to know what Russia needs in the future. The second step is to alert those manufacturers that their product is being diverted. And the third one is to work with them to try to figure out what visibility they have on their own supply chain. It can be limited, but if we pull together different responses from different manufacturers, we can obtain a level of information that manufacturers on their own cannot attain. So working together with manufacturers, we have cases where US companies then come back to us and say, this model you have identified of our product in a weapon, Now we have a new company asking for it. It's not sanctioned, it's not listed, but can you tell us more about it? And we have, through that method of preemption, we have identified companies based in China that have been diverting components of millions of dollars of components to sanctioned companies in Russia. And the result is that last Friday, that specific company has now been sanctioned and listed. So this work between civil society working in the field,
Right,
and the manufacturers and the government can have a very, very strong effect.
Thank you very much, and thanks for your indulgence, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Senator Hassan, and thank you for making the critical point that this kind of inquiry and the more effective enforcement of sanctions and export control is no substitute for the kind of military and humanitarian assistance contained in the supplemental. And we want to degrade the Russian military capability, but at the same time, we need to enhance Ukraine's capability, provide it with the long-range artillery that is so important to destroying the command centers and the munitions storage depots that they can and will destroy, the Kerch Bridge, which is an essential link to Crimea. Those kinds of targets require that long-range artillery. And the stark fact that we heard when we visited Ukraine, not only from President Zelensky and his military team, but from our own military leadership there and our intelligence community, is Ukraine can win. They will win if they have that kind of support, but without it, they will lose. And so, as important as this inquiry is, it is no substitute for the kind of aid that the House must approve. That supplemental is absolutely vital for Ukraine's continuing fight on the battlefield. And right now, they are losing troops and they're losing ground because they simply don't have enough ammunition. And that is criminal, in my view. Let me ask Mr. Spleeters, we've heard from some industry advocates that the reason Russia is able to acquire recently manufactured chips is because they repurpose them from things like washing machines or other household appliances. In your written testimony, you wrote that this idea, and I'm quoting, couldn't be further from the truth. How do you know that repurposed chips are not the main driver behind what's now being recovered from Russian weapon systems?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for this question. We have seen no evidence of this happening. So opening those systems, we have seen no evidence of chips being ripped off and then repurposed for this. And frankly, I'm always open to new evidence coming up, and it may come in the future. But to us, it makes little sense that Russia would buy a $500 washing machine for a $1 part that they could obtain more easily otherwise. Some of these chips, of course, can also fit household appliances, but others cannot, unless your washing machine can fly, which I doubt. The components that we find in Russian drones do not fit washing machines. So right now we have no evidence to support that hypothesis.
Washing machines are not flying
Not
yet. Neither are elephants. There are a lot of myths surrounding these parts and components reaching Russians, but I think it is irrefutable that the Russians have found a way to circumvent the export controls and the sanctions. Ms. Rybakova, based on your research, would you agree that these parts and components come from sources other than washing machines?
Thank you so much. I full-heartedly agree with that. So as you know, the coalition of countries led by the US identified 45 priority items, and you put them up on the chart, the battlefield goods. These are different trade categories. And we monitor Russia's imports of these specific trade categories. So this category does not include washing machines that don't fly. It's specifically battlefield goods. And we have seen a significant pickup in imports. That said, in the first months after the beginning of the war, the full-scale invasion and imposition of export controls, we've seen a drop. It almost halved for so many months, for a few months, and then it picked up again as Russia found evasion techniques. So we see evidence of Russia continuing to import these new components. Many of them are produced outside the United States on behalf of the US companies.
Thank you. And I know your organization has published reports. After those reports were published, numerous banks apparently reached out to you to make sure that they were not inadvertently helping transfer funds supporting export control evasion. Is that correct?
It is correct. We're not a big organization, so we don't do much outreach. We're just a few people doing research. So as soon as our report was published in June and then was featured in Newsweek and Politico and other outlets, within the first week, we had a few financial institutions reach out to us from their compliance departments asking how we can cooperate, how they can obtain similar data, what are the red flags we're picking up. And since then, it has continued.
And let me ask you, did any semiconductor companies reach out to you after you published your first report on this topic in 2023 or in 2024 when you did a follow-up report?
So far, no semiconductor company has reached out to us, but we're, of course, open to cooperate. We want to make it better together, and we're happy to share any findings, data research, and to work together with them.
And did you reach out to those semiconductor companies?
We have sent our reports to these companies, and also our reports have been featured in the press extensively, so they could have also seen it there.
But you've received no response?
We have not yet received responses.
Crickets, nothing.
We hope to hear from them soon.
Well, I have to say I'm really deeply troubled by the lack of any response after those reports were issued and after you reached out to provide them with copies of those reports. It seems like they really didn't want to know or didn't want to act in response to those reports. Mr. Byrne, did any semiconductor companies reach out to your organization after you published your report in 2022?
Limited, but we have had some conversation with some of the semiconductor companies. But again, I would say that is relatively limited in people that have wanted to talk to us.
In fact, as I understand it, NVIDIA reached out to you, correct?
Yes.
But not Analog Devices, not AMD, not Intel, not Texas Instruments, correct?
We have spoken to Intel, but the others, I don't believe so.
No response from any of them except Intel. And what was Intel's inquiry? Our position, like my colleagues, is we are on a mission to help and disrupt the supply chains. We are very, very happy to talk to anybody. We welcome engagement. We want to show them how we do it. And, you know, we're very happy with that. That's what we would welcome. So any of these companies that want to speak to us, we very much welcome an outreach. But they really haven't sought it.
We've had very little.
Your organization's work relies on the cooperation of the semiconductors to conduct tracing, correct?
We have done some of that, but it's slightly different than Damien. We have taken a slightly different approach, which is what my team does, open source intelligence. And so we've done the work backwards. So we have been in Ukraine. We have taken apart a lot of weapons and documented the components. And we've tried to work out on a big picture the supply chains of how they move into the country. And we've had a lot of success doing so using a range of sources. So we know how components are getting in many, many cases, and not just components, machine tools, bearings, a range of things. And I'd just like to add on the washing machine story. I mean, we have, again, we haven't seen any evidence of that, but we do have evidence of the fact that supply chains going directly to sanctioned companies, to Russian military entities procuring this stuff on the market that then ends up in Russian weapons platforms.
So these parts and components, the brains of precision munitions, as one of you said, are not going through washing machines. They're going through distributors. The companies know who the distributors are. They know the countries where the distributors are located, and they know the weapons where those parts and components are used. On the topic of what can be done, Ms. Rybakova, you published an op-ed, I think yesterday, or maybe it was today, and I want to quote one of the lessons, I think it's the second lesson in that op-ed, quote, "The consequences of non-compliance must be strong enough to affect companies. Evasion of sanctions is a predictable reaction for companies drawn to profitable markets. Introducing steeper penalties coupled with an increased likelihood of detection can significantly reshape their risk-reward calculus," end quote. Again, as a former prosecutor, I know if the penalties aren't high enough, there will be disobedience. If there is a penalty that inflicts pain, then companies will pay attention. Could you expand on that point?
Thank you so much. As macroeconomist, indeed, I approach this as a risk-reward analysis. On one hand, we have any company wants to make money legally for their shareholders. On the other hand, compliance departments are extremely costly. You can talk to banks. It is a difficult, costly endeavor, which not every company wants to invest into. On the other side of the scale, you have the probability of being caught, the cost of being caught, and how quickly you will be punished if you were to do something wrong. So there is a sort of a financial equation that many companies look at. And therefore, we need to tip that scale towards companies themselves investing in compliance departments that will catch the shipments before they reach the malign actors. Because by the time they reach the end user or end use, it is already too late. It's almost impossible for authorities to go and check that and find that. So that's what I was trying to explain in my op-ed.
Thank you. I'm going to turn to the ranking member. I have a few more questions, but I don't want to keep him.
Yeah, I don't have too many. Again, I would encourage these companies. They're large multinational corporations. They have sophisticated systems. They should be able to provide better tracing, better controls. I would encourage them to reach out to you. To the extent that we've asked responses from them, they should respond to this committee. But talking about getting responses to oversight requests, I would just ask the chairman again, I have yet to receive, for example, the last 50 emails of Anthony Fauci that are heavily redacted. I have yet to receive the analysis of CDC and FDA in terms of how they looked at the VAERS system. So I would ask the chairman to please, join me in further requests, and if we have to subpoena that information. These are government employees. We pay their salaries. The information they collect is public information, should be public information. The analysis they do on that data should be made available to the public, and they are completely opaque. They're not being transparent. And so, again, this committee has a great deal of authority in terms of requesting material. People should be responsive to it. The chip manufacturers, definitely, and I encourage that, but in particular, government agencies ought to do this. So again, I'll call one more time to please join me in letters, phone calls, and if necessary, subpoenas to get this information. Anthony Fauci's final 50 pages that remain redacted and the analysis on the VAERS system. Thank you.
I don't want to be distracted here, but I would point out to the chairman, and he should ask his staff, we have actually been in touch with HHS. We have asked for this information and their cooperation. We will pursue other means to get it.
So I appreciate that then. Thank you. And let's, if we have to, though, we may have to go to subpoena. Because they're,
I'm ruling out nothing.
yeah,
But
okay, thank
as
you.
the, as the ranking member knows, we have a process beginning with outreach, which we've done. If it doesn't produce a satisfactory response, we'll proceed with that process.
And the only reason I've been after this for a couple of years, so you do tend to get impatient after that. So
understand.
again, I appreciate your working with me on that then.
Let me ask just a few more questions with your indulgence. This testimony has been extremely valuable. And I should make clear, this investigation is going to be pursued by this subcommittee based on what you've told us today and other information that you may be able to provide us in the future. But I want to ask some questions about the broader national security implications of export controls. We focused today on American microchips that are making it to Russia, but insurance compliance with export control restrictions has larger implications all around the world, as I mentioned earlier. Mr. Spleeters, I understand that your work has traced American semiconductors found in Iranian and North Korean weapons, and you found that they're taking similar pathways to United States chips found in Russian weapons. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. We've very recently been able to open up a North Korean missile that was used in January against Ukraine, and we have found that a lot of those components were actually produced in the last 3 years, despite sanctions on North Korea.
And these paths are occurring after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, correct?
Yes, because those as I was saying, those components sometimes were produced in 2023.
And so would it be possible that Russian evasion of United States sanctions is serving as a kind of model for other possible aggressors and adversaries?
I think they might take lessons from it, certainly, but they have been doing it for a certain number of years as well. So, I think they see this as perhaps an easy path to go around export control. As long as export control is not made more effective, they will continue to do so.
Mr. Byrne, your organization has tracked a North Korean vessel known for violating international sanctions that made a cargo delivery, I believe, to a Russian port after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Could you provide some detail about that finding?
Yes, certainly, Chairman. Since August 2023, a number of Russian vessels, cargo ro-ro vessels, have loaded what we believe are likely thousands of containers of munitions from the North Korean port of Rajin and delivered them to Russian facilities in the Far East, where we believe they're shipped towards the front in Ukraine. So we now know, despite Russia's membership of the UN Security Council and its support of UN Security Council resolutions against North Korean weapons transfers, that they themselves are violating these resolutions and procuring not just munitions, but now ballistic missiles from North Korea and using them on European soil. It's incredible, it's egregious. Having done this for a long time, I never thought I would see this.
Would it be accurate to say that the trends that we're seeing in terms of the lack of enforcement, which is not futility, I want to emphasize, the failure to enforce law is not a sign of futility. We are not condemned to ineffective enforcement. We can do something about it. Would it be accurate to say that the trends we're seeing today could have larger implications for Iran as well as North Korea?
We are facing geopolitically a very dangerous situation. There's conflict spreading across the world. It is not just Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It is, tensions rising on the peninsula, Iranian activities, the Houthis' activities in the Red Sea. I mean, there's a huge range of problems. The convergence of North Korean, Iranian, and Russian interests in this war, the cooperation on the manufacture of weapons, the moving of Iranian factories to Russia to make these UAVs, the use of ballistic missiles, North Korean, that are now tested in Russia. These are all incredibly dangerous developments that pushes our enemies closer together. Whilst we have sanctions, whilst we have export controls, we have to do more on the enforcement of these cases. The North Korean economy for years has been externalized. Most of it exists in Chinese banks. That's where their money sits. Now we've heard recently that the Russians are unfreezing assets. We need to go after these banks. We need to go after these assets that the North Koreans have. The US historically has been very effective at this. The Department of Justice and the FBI, they've taken out a number of these North Korean networks, but we've taken our foot off the gas. And it's not just the United States, but in many other places. And we need to put our foot back on the gas, and we need to get after them.
We know how to do it, but we're not doing it.
Yes.
Ms. Rybakova, how reliant are U.S. export control systems on the compliance measures put in place by private companies? In other words, their record keeping, their, in effect, trying to know what's going on.
We are almost entirely reliant in some cases on the company's reporting. And that is a concern because it's always good to cross-check because we'll make mistakes, it's natural, right? Especially when the production happens outside the United States, it's then so much harder because the good never actually exits physically from the United States, and therefore we don't have a customs record that will allow us to cross-check what the company is reporting. So therefore it's critical to incorporate the compliance procedures in the companies that either on behalf of the United States company or license or joint venture is producing these chips, how the compliance procedures there work. And we as macroeconomists, most of the data is set up for macroeconomic analysis. It's unfortunately not set up for analyzing how to clean up value chains.
So if a company takes the position or posture of the cartoon character, I don't know whether you're familiar with Sergeant Schultz, it may have predated your knowledge, but his favorite mantra was, "I see nothing." If a company chooses to see nothing or hear nothing, the difficulty of tracing and stopping this kind of violation of our export controls is all the higher, correct?
It's an extraordinary difficulty, and we have seen that in accounting and auditing, right? When an external auditor comes in and there are no internal processes, we're going to get a very inconclusive or very not clear report on the audit, right? Because a few employees entering a company and trying to find the individual item is almost impossible. We have seen in shipments between China and Russia, it's more than 20,000 shipments of just a certain type of a chip per month. In terms of the data sets of the companies sending components to Russia, it's more than 800,000 sort of in just 1 year, in a few months. So for a few hundred government employees that are responsible to control and implement and enforce all of export controls globally, because again, the US is a leader in this respect, it is not humanly possible to be able to do that without the internal culture change and compliance change within the corporate.
And the trends that we're discussing here, again, I've asked others about them, relate not only to Russia, but also Iran and North Korea, and as you point out in that op-ed published just today, to China, correct?
Absolutely. We see a lot of sort of new supply chain networks, distribution networks are registered in Hong Kong, in China, including in Hong Kong. There's some companies that sort of almost specialize in this business. There are some corporate secretariats that provide different shell companies, and if you close one, they open another. So we need to go again after this supply of the sort of alternative supply networks and distributors. And they work with, as my colleagues have pointed out, they work with Iran, North Korea, and now they're happily providing service to Russia as well.
You would agree, Mr. Byrne. I see you nodding your head.
Yes, 100%, yes. Hong Kong, in the case of microelectronics, Hong Kong is a particular concern. It's a large liquid market, it has a big financial industry, but so much moves through there, and historically on the North Korean side as well. But we've been looking at this for a long time, and Hong Kong has become very important for the Russians.
Senator Johnson, do you have any other questions? I want to just close by, again, quoting your op-ed. Quote, "We are at risk of undermining our sanctions if the private sector and malign actors learn that we cannot enforce new measures," meaning new sanctions. I think that is a critical piece of guidance, and we need to know that effective enforcement is key to our credibility all around the world, as well as Ukraine winning this fight. So here's what we know. We know that despite sanctions, semiconductors are reaching Russia, and they're used in weapon systems in a magnitude and scope that is truly horrifying. We know that these semiconductors are manufactured by United States companies, and they either know or should know what's happening. And we know that the sale of this United States technology to companies bordering Russia has increased drastically since the war in Ukraine began. Let me be absolutely clear. We're not drawing conclusions as to illegality. We have questions for the companies, not just those four: Intel, Analog, AMD, and Texas Instruments, but for others on this chart. We have questions for Commerce and Treasury departments, as well as for other United States agencies. We need to understand how United States technology is being permitted to fuel the Russian war machine. The sanctions imposed by the United States and its allies are not meant to be a sieve. They are meant to be an impregnable wall. We can't hope for perfection in enforcement, but the fact that 95% of the Russian weapons having these kinds of semiconductors and other parts and components come from the United States or our allies is a pretty devastating statistic. These sales have to be stopped. So we need more enforcement, more resources, stronger authority, more compliance, and more diligence on the part of the companies. Our preliminary observations suggest that we need all of it, not just one kind of action. The continued flow of technology to an authoritarian regime like Russia is emblematic of a larger failing with huge national security implications for the United States. And our failure here could have implications for Iran and North Korea, China, as well as others. So the struggle in Ukraine is about democracy, not just our democracy, not just Ukraine's democracy, but democracies around the world. Their fight is our fight. Enforcement of these sanctions is a part of that fight, and this subcommittee is going to do its best to get to the root causes of the failure to stop Russia's building of its war machine with United States semiconductors, chips, and other parts of components. I want to thank our witnesses again. You've been extremely valuable. The record in this hearing will remain open for 15 days in case there are additional comments or questions by my colleagues. And with that, the subcommittee's hearing is adjourned. Thank you.